Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation on the global business of food. My name is Anu Ramohan, and I'm in the economics discipline, and my two colleagues, Hyan Liu and Andrew Williams, will also be presenting here. And I'm going to talk about food security and economic development. So basically, I'll talk about the meaning of food security and talk about the importance of food security for economic development, and I'll give you some idea about areas where we have problems with food security, and I'll present my conclusions. Okay, so to begin with, what do we mean by food security? So food security is actually a multifaceted concept, and it includes interdisciplinary ideas, and basically what it means is that it reflects a population's physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that is able to meet their dietary needs and preferences for a healthy and active life. So it's basically conceptualized as resting on three pillars. So it's the availability of food, the access to food, and the utilization of food. So it's not just about food production, which is what we commonly think of when we think about food security, but it means availability is simply the physical availability of food. So this depends on factors such as the processing of food and trade and stockpiling of food, and effects such as water and soil management that might impact adversely or positively on food supplies. From an economics perspective, we care about access to food. Access to food is about whether the people in the population have the ability to buy the food that is being produced. So when we talk about access to food, we're talking about factors such as the physical infrastructure, whether there's enough food to if there's enough, the transportation or the physical infrastructure is enabling food to come from production to the retail sector, whether the marketing is being done in an effective manner, whether the food is being equitably distributed, and whether it is affordable. And finally, we talk about the utilization of food. The utilization reflects the way in which food that is being produced is consumed and whether it's nutritious, whether it is, it's safety, and whether it's good quality, whether people have access to clean water and sanitation. Okay, so there is a fundamental link between food security and economic development, because tackling hunger is not just about boosting the food that is being produced, it's also about increasing the incomes of the producers and strengthening the markets. So the poor people's access to food will be enhanced more rapidly when economic growth is more broad-based and when it creates jobs and economic opportunities. And the reason I keep talking about the poor here is when you think about food security, and when we look at where the food insecure people are, they tend to be in the poorest countries in the world. And these tend to be the households of farmers and their families, fishermen, and livestock producers in the poorest regions in the world. So in many countries, what we observe is that the rise in inequality can be linked, at least in part, to the slow growth in agriculture, because food production in the agricultural sector is not keeping up with the technology, and oftentimes they're not using high quality seeds, and they are subject to climate change and adverse weather patterns and so on. And because it continues to employ some of the world's poorest people and pays lower wages than in industry or services, what we find is that small food crises can lead to civil unrest and so on. So why is food security a global challenge? So it is estimated that by 2015, the world will need to feed an additional, about 9 billion people. And so the demand for food is going to be 60% greater than what it is today. And the United Nations has set ending hunger, achieving food security, and improved nutrition as a key goal. And it has put promoting sustainable agriculture as the second of its sustainable development goals. So food security is not just a goal in itself, but it is also linked to other sustainable development goals, such as nutrition and so on. So it has impacts on not just the ability to access food, but also on the nutrition and also other aspects, because access to food is fundamental for creating children who are who are healthy, and that in turn has impacts on their future ability to be part of society, get a good education, and participate. So if you look at what trends we've seen in proportion of people that are food insecure, we actually see that there has been a decline. So in 1990, when the Millennium Development Goals were first announced, one of the targets was to halve the number of hungry in the world. So at that point, we had 23.3% of the population that was defined as being undernourished. So on this axis, we have the millions of people that are undernourished. And on the other axis, that tells you the percentage of people that are undernourished. So what we see here is that between 1990-92 to 2014-16, we see that there has been nearly a halving of the proportion of people that are undernourished or defined as being hungry. And at the same time, what we see is the population has been growing, remember? So, the proportion, so we had about 1 billion people that were defined as being, undernourished or hungry, and that has actually declined to 780 million. So despite the increase in population over the last 2 decades, we have actually seen substantial improvement in the proportions of people that are defined as being hungry. But what we observe is, if you look at the world's map, this is a hunger map that was put out by the World Food Programme. What we see is that it is quite inequitable. So we can see that we have pockets of countries, areas like Australia, North America, Brazil, Argentina, and obviously Northern Europe, where we find that these are food-secure populations. At the same time, we see areas in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular Congo, where we see that about 70% of their population is undernourished. And that is actually quite surprising, given that Congo actually has enough natural assets in order to feed the entire African population. So what is the problem here, do you think? One of the problems is that the farming techniques are quite primitive in some sense, and the farmers are not able to access the world markets. They're not able to take advantage of international trade. And then agricultural policies in these countries have led to a focus on cash crops, so that poor households and farming households in particular are relying on imported food to sustain their households and to feed their livestock. So the other big problem worldwide is that there is actually a high wastage of food. So if you look at this, from production to retailing, this is the per capita, so per person food loss in terms of kilograms per year, which is quite substantial if you look at it. We are actually wasting food that is enough to feed 3 billion people, whereas there's about 1 billion people that are dying of hunger, almost 1 billion. So where is this food loss happening? It's not just in Europe and North America. It's also happening in countries in South and Southeast Asia, which we said are amongst the most food insecure. So why is this happening, do you think? Part of the problem is that it's not just the fact that they have poor infrastructure. It means that they have poor refrigeration, and it may mean that there's a lot of post-harvest losses, there's pests and so on, which means that at the farm itself, at the production site, there is a lot of wastage, okay? And there's droughts and loss of crops. On top of that, because they don't have good infrastructure to reach the markets, we find that the food that is produced is not getting to the consumer. So this is a problem in developing countries. What is happening in Europe and North America is partly that there is a lot of food wastage at the production end because the food may not be aesthetically good enough to meet the supermarket demand, or there's too much overstocking in the supermarkets, which means that oftentimes a lot of food is thrown out, which could be fed to farm animals and so on, but it's not. And of course, there's consumer wastage of food where you buy more than what you need and you end up throwing it out when it's past its use by consumption date. So to sum up, the problem is not of production. The problem is the complexity of being able to distribute the food that is being produced to the population. And part of the problem is that unfortunately, the hungry people tend to live in developing countries, and they tend to be farming households. And so what's happening is that food security, although it has become part of a national priority, and indeed international organizations have also become quite conscious of the importance of improving food security, there is a recognition that food security underpins all other development. It's not just economic development, it's also human development, as food security has impacts on health, education, and other human development indices. And without being food secure, farming households or poor households tend to prioritize food over all the other aspects. And what happens then is it means that addressing the problem of hunger and malnutrition in poor countries with the highest numbers of food insecure people requires improvements in the productivity of the agricultural sector. So it requires improvements in infrastructure, it requires improvements in technology, access to good quality seeds, and so on. And particularly, this is an issue for smallholder farmers. And we see that there has been a dramatic decline in arable land, which is land that can be cultivated. So, and then we have these adverse weather patterns. So we see that rural and farming communities typically experience a higher incidence of poverty and hunger, and productivity growth in agriculture is quite central to improving economic growth, reducing poverty, and improving food security. So it has positive effects. So food security will imply lower food prices for consumers, higher incomes for producers, and through the growth multiplier effects, we would expect that the rest of the economy will also improve, and we'll see improvements in food demand for food and services. Okay, that's it. So you have any questions? Thank you. I'll just pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And just follow Professor Anu's the last point, the food prices and high incomes. My topic will be the income price sensitivity of the diets globally. So basically, we are examining how the income and the price affect your consumption of the food. So the motivation here is, if you look at these two pictures, what can you see? A big contrast, right? Can you guess where these families come from? On the left, yes, you've been doing my presentation before. So on the left, it's a family in Norway, and on the right, it's a family in Chad. And this picture shows a week's food for these two families. And on the left, what we see is there are a lot of food, and obviously high quality, and there seems a lot of different colors and different packages, so they have more variety of the food, right? But on the right, if you look at, you only see a couple of different kind of cereals and a bowl of water, and that's their food for a week. And so Norway is one of the richest countries in the world, with a GDP per capita roughly $62 $1,000. Well, Chad is one of the poorest countries in the Central Africa, and the GDP per capita is only $2,000. But what interesting thing is, if you look at the last row in the below, the food budget share, this food budget share tells us the proportion of your income devoted to food. So if it's 11% in Norway, that means this family spent 11% of the income on food. But this share is actually high, up to 51%. So for that family in Chad, they spend roughly half their income on food. And just a little bit summary, so we see a rich country versus poor countries. And what we see is we see high quantity, quality, and a more variety food in rich, which is Norway here. But the interesting thing is the budget share is quite slow. It's very small, excuse me. And so imagine if you live in Norway and you got additional income, what is the proportion you will spend on the food? It will be a very small number, right? But if you live in Chad, just imagine for a minute, and if you got additional income, the proportion you will spend on food will be much larger than the one in Norway. So this leads to our first concept, the income sensitivity of the food. And it can be measured in terms of income elasticity. And basically, this elasticity is a ratio of the consumption change over the income change. So in the paper, Gao 2011, the food income elasticity for all countries put together is 0.62. So this means if our income increased 10%, the consumption of food increased 6%. And this income elasticity actually varies across two different income groups. So in the rich countries, this income elasticity can be very low, roughly 0.2 or 3. But in the poor countries, this elasticity can go up high to 0.9. So now we know if our income increased 10%, our food consumption increased 6%. But obviously, we have different kinds of food, right? We got meats, fruit, vegetables. Are these goods all increasing at the same rate? Or they increase at a different rate? So this is what we're looking at here. So we separate the total food into 6 groups. So we got staples, meats, dairy, fruit, veggies, sweet things, and other foods. And we use the data from the World Bank, and with the magic of the econometric method, we found that the income elasticity for staples within food is only 0.7. So this tells us if the food consumption increased 10%, your staples consumption only increased 7%. So staples is roughly a necessity in our food categories. And what happens to the other 5 groups? You see the magnitude varies, right? So for the meat and seafood, with the highest value is 1.23. So this means if your food consumption increased 10%, the meat and seafood is actually increased more than that, 12%. So meat and seafood increase faster than the food consumption as a whole. So it is a luxury in our food categories. And similar for the sweet things. It's at 1.12, so it's above 1 also. So here we see staples and dairy is less than 1, so they're both a necessity, while meat and sweet things, they're above 1, so they are luxury in our food categories, which means we consumers treated these goods actually differently. Yeah. So that's our income sensitivity. And our second concept is price sensitivity. And again, this sensitivity measures in terms of elasticity. And basically, it's a ratio of your consumption change over the price change. There are actually 2 types of price elasticity, the own price elasticity and the cross price elasticity. But here we only focus on the own price elasticity. That is to say, if one good's own price increase, the consumption of this good will decrease, right? If the price goes higher, the consumption will decreasing. So for the own price elasticity here, it will always be negative. And again, in this paper, what we found is this food price elasticity is negative 0.27. So this tells us if the food price increased 10%, your food consumption actually decreasing 2.7%. And again, this elasticity also varies across different income countries. For rich countries, this elasticity tends to be lower because you are less sensitive to those price change. But in poor countries, this elasticity can go be higher. But what about this again, 6 groups? Are they going to respond the same to those price change? So for staples here, we see that the price elasticity for staples is negative 0.72, which means if our staples price increase 10%, your consumption is going to decrease 7.2%. And these are the elasticity for other 5 groups. You see all the values different across these kind of groups. So again, regarding the price change, we also treated these commodities differently. And if you see the highest value is for these sweet things. Can I press that? Oops, sorry. Sweet things at negative 1.23. And why we need these elasticities? And I'll just give you one example, is if the government consider tax policy or subsidizing policy, suppose if the government consider the tax on the sugar, they want to reduce the consumption of the sugar because it's unhealthy food, they might use this elasticity. So this elasticity tells us if we want to reduce the sugar consumption by 20%, the tax rate roughly is 16%. And if the government wants to increase the consumption of our vegetables, and that's a healthy food, and they will use elasticity, this elasticity shows that if, roughly speaking, if we want to increase vegetables and fruits consumption by 10%, the price, the government is subsidizing the price by 10% because the price elasticity is roughly 1. And just to wrap up, what we found is the income and price elasticity actually vary across food groups. So we treated these food groups differently, respond to the price or income change. And from the income elasticity, we found staples and dairy a necessity, while meat, sweet things are sort of luxury. And the last thing is those price elasticity, and I use sweet things for example, and with elasticity is negative 1.23, which means if we want to reduce our sweet things consumption by 20%, the tax rate is roughly 16%. So, yeah, that's it for my talk. Thank you. Any question? Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I'll pass to Dr. Andrew.
Yep, I'll take that. Thanks. These things are a bit annoying. Okay, so my name's Andrew Williams. I'm from the Economics Department as well. And I'm taking a slightly different route today in terms of food. I'm looking at an extreme end of this. And that's essentially, Anu was talking about security, food security. And this is obviously when everything breaks down. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about famine today. Not just going hungry or being undernourished, but actual famine. We're looking at whether essentially it's climate or whether indeed there are man-made issues here. So this is an important issue because roughly about the same number of people have died in famines over the course of the 20th century as all the wars combined in the 20th century, World War I, II, etc. So it's not a trivial issue at all. And so we want to be able to have a look at what are some of the issues here. And there are some fairly obvious ones, of course, but we also want to look at some of the sort of other causes that might be at issue here. So obviously climate is the first one. Poor weather conditions, droughts, sometimes floods. Can I use this? Yeah, I can. Cool. Droughts and floods. I mean, obviously you can't have a famine without some severe sort of economic, weather-related issue. But of course, floods and droughts occur, sort of semi-regularly around the world in all regions. And yet there are some regions of the world that have not had a famine for centuries, if ever, whilst others routinely seem to have them. And so that's really what I want to look at the moment today. Okay. So essentially in the 20th century, almost all of the famines that have occurred have been geographically sort of limited to two areas, essentially Africa and Asia. I don't have a clicker here. So here's a quote from Amartya Sen, who's sort of, besides winning a Nobel Prize, is probably one of the best sort of philosopher-economists of the 20th century. And he made the point a number of years ago that no famine has ever taken place. He said in the history of the world, this is probably it's a sweeping statement, but and it has been sort of questioned a little bit, but essentially he's correct here, that no famine has ever occurred in the world where the region has a functioning democracy. Not just democracy, because democracy is a bit of any time a country has democratic in its title, it's the complete opposite. So we've got the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and things like that. So he's talking about an actual functioning democracy, and I'll talk a little bit more about what functioning means in a sec, because that's important. So how obviously does this prevent large-scale famines? Well, the two major, well, there's more than two, I guess, but the two that I'm going to talk about in the time that I've got today. The first one, and this goes to the heart of a functioning democracy, is of course that you need some sort of political competition. Okay, you need essentially the people who are in power to know that they don't necessarily will always be in power. In other words, people have an alternative, and that obviously clarifies their mind somewhat when it comes to crises such as famines. And the other one that we look at a lot is an independent press, a free press. Yeah? Now these are sort of mutually reinforcing. They sort of have the same effect, if you like, on the government of the day on a food crisis. And there are others, of course, and I'm not trying to pretend that these are the only reasons that we have famines or anything like that at all. And there are other sort of what we might call institutional factors as well, corruption, functioning bureaucracy, etc. But they also tend to go hand in hand with these other two as well. Now, of course, the argument or the rationale here is a simple one, of course, that in areas where the government needs to be responsive, and they need to be responsive because they have political competition, they have someone who could take power at the ballot if push comes to shove, and they are also responsive in the sense that the press highlights the negative situation that's happening in terms of the food crisis, the food insecurity. If you've got those two things, then essentially they're far more likely to be responsive to those needs. They're far more likely to try and prevent it because it's in their interests. They're still, politicians of any stripe are always acting in their self-interest. And if they know that there's a chance that they can be voted out, essentially, if they don't do a good job, then the result is often that we have a more responsive government. And so there's a sort of, I was going to say famous paper, but that's famous for nerds like us. But a well-known paper from roughly about 15 years ago, where these two guys looked at state-level data in India. So this is not at a national level, but a sub-national level, and all the state governments, if you like, that are in India. Now, India's a nice one to look at from this perspective, because it's not a rich country. So we're not just talking about money. In other words, if you've got more money, you're going to be able to overcome the crisis. Sure, that is clearly an issue here, yeah? But it's, in fact, also related to the issue of the government accountability, corruption, etc. as well. But so it's not a rich country, and historically India, of course, has had a large number of famines, but not necessarily over the past 50 or 60 years. They had a couple of really nasty ones in the late 19th century, whilst it was still under colonial rule. But since that time, it's not necessarily had a massive famine. But within the country, there are degrees of how well the state governments have responded to this. Yeah. So in other words, the state governments have different degrees of what Sen called these functioning democracies, to greater or lesser extent. And they looked at this issue of the independent press by looking at things like newspaper circulation. In other words, where information was greater, and I'll use the term information in a really broad kind of way, what happened? And the fancy statistics and econometrics they came out with really was quite clear and unequivocal in many respects. Those states, of course, that had the greater political competition and the ones that had greater newspaper circulation. So in other words, the population, more of the population was reading about the situation that was happening. The government was far, far more responsive in terms of getting... So when you have a crisis, if you have a drought or whatever, the main issue is in distribution. You're clearly not growing any food in that area, that's the whole problem. But the whole issue is getting the food distributed in a timely manner, and in a manner that is going where its greatest need is. And of course, so where the governments were better, we find that the government's responsiveness of getting... There's a couple of variations that they use, but it's essentially food distribution, emergency food distribution was sort of what they were looking at. It was much better, okay? And so, in other words, when you're talking about this, you really have to understand that one of the problems, and as I said, there's only one, is to do with the sort of what we broadly call in economics the institutional quality of the government around. Now, I'll flick through these a little bit quickly, but what I've got here is a measure. It's the most common one we use when we're trying to measure how free a press is. I've ranked them from worst, which is North Korea, to best, which is Sweden, I think. And I've got these little ones in red. So all I want to show is very quickly, these are some of the more, the worst, if you like, famines that we've had over the past sort of 30 or 40 years. I've tried to roughly keep it in this time frame of where the freedom of press is measured. Not quite, but so North Korea, excess mortality, that's essentially people who died as a result of the famine that wouldn't otherwise have died. About 2 million. Somalia in the early 90s. We've got China. Now, China is out of this range, but China has the dubious record, I think, of having the worst famine in the 20th century by a reasonable margin. And so I've put them there. Congo, Ethiopia, and you can see essentially that all of these are the red ones here. So you can see all of the ones where the famines were essentially the worst, in terms of the number of deaths, if you like, really all occur in these places that have a very, very poor press freedom, essentially no press freedom. Yeah? Malawi, you can see, had one. This is an interesting one because this is relatively recently, and you can see that basically they had it was a really nasty drought, apparently, really poor weather conditions, but they're sort of roughly in the middle. They've been improving over the past couple of decades, and so they had negligible deaths. And the two up here that I just quickly mentioned is, of course, Australia in particular, but also the US also has droughts, fairly severe ones, right? But we don't even think about it. We don't even think about emergency distribution. We don't think about people starving. And why? Well, at least part of it is because, of course, we've got both the capacity in terms of the government, but also the idea that things could never get that bad because of these institutional conditions. Okay, this last one is just I won't linger on this one, but essentially, same sort of thing. It's a different measure of information. So this is the idea of sort of the government, the press, if you like, conveying the information about what's happening. And you get a very similar story, okay? All the ones where had high mortality, excess mortality, down at the lower end, and of course, again, Australia and the US scores very highly in this. And the last thing I want to say, because I know I'm running out of time, is a kind of a counter-example. And I'll say the older people in the audience, but I include myself in that, so don't worry. The more mature members of the audience, is this, okay? Now remember from the early 80s, this is in the Horn of Africa, it was Ethiopia essentially, or mainly, but there were other countries affected as well. And this is about 1983, I think, from memory. 81, 83. And so we've got here is a picture of a BBC reporter whose name escapes me, holding starving, horrible images that came out at that time in the news. We've got Time magazine. Time regularly puts things like this on their covers. And then, of course, as a result of that, we had Live Aid, and this is Bob Geldof and all his, and the songs and the concerts, etc., which I just remember, barely remember, because I was incredibly young. But the thing that I wanted to point out here is that the pressure came from outside. So by the time everyone got in there, the famine was there, and people had died. Many people had died. And it was only when the media outside the country started imposing, transferring the message, telling everyone about it, that actually something really got done about it. And I'm not suggesting that the problem was solved or anything, and there is a debate about how many lives, if you like, were saved by Bob Geldof and Bono and all the rest of them. But nevertheless, it certainly it raised the profile of it, and certainly a lot more food did eventually get distributed in that area. But unfortunately, the countries within, that were being affected, like Ethiopia, I mean, there was civil conflict as well, which never helps and is another issue for another day. But they did not have a free press. The rest of the country didn't know, or had very little information. The distribution of the food was horrendous, and very little political competition. All those things that I was just talking about. But the outside essentially had to do it. The pressure came from the press, or from the media, I should say, in a broader sense. Yeah. Now, just because that was all kind of sad, and I had nasty pictures of starving children and stuff, I just want to end with a slightly more positive note. This actually is the number of people, this excess mortality, I guess, famine victims. This might be a bit difficult for you to read here. This is from the 1860s, essentially, to 2010, or the 2010s. And you can see that this is essentially the 20th century. Now, the first part of the 20th century, these are big numbers. That's China. There's a couple here in Soviet Russia as well, which again sort of supports this thesis in terms of, certainly not a free press, certainly no political competition at that stage. So the first half of the 20th century wasn't terrific. But you can see, even though we're talking about these horrible pictures from Ethiopia and Sudan and Somalia from sort of the 80s, 90s, the numbers that we're actually talking about here are a lot less. So at least in that sense, we're not seeing literally tens of millions of people starving. And we certainly haven't seen that since, that's the 1970s onwards. So hopefully at least the story's getting more optimistic in terms of at least the numbers of people. Okay. Done. Thank you. Now, I think we've got about 5 minutes, so up here. Come on. If anyone's got any questions, now can I ask you to do the? Does anyone have any questions? Because if you do, you have to speak into the microphone.
No.
When you mentioned that the elasticity for the price and for different kinds of groups, do you consider the effects of the price elasticity shift from the one group to another? So is there any significant difference from the one group to another that contribute to any change of the elasticity? So you understand the question, right?
Yeah, in the result I show you is actually I put all the countries together. So these elasticities, they are different. Are you saying different income countries? Yes, these price elasticity normally for example, in Australia, probably meats would be sort of our dominant groups, right? So the price elasticity of meats in Australia probably going to be lower than the one I show you. Yeah. But for the staples, if you consume less, it's not a dominant it's not the dominant part in your diets, the price elasticity tend to be a little bit higher. But yes, these elasticity, they are different, but I didn't show you. Like, I just put all the countries together as a constant. Yeah, cool.
It's actually all three of you. I would be quite interested to hear your opinion. I'm just written down a note here from your talk. It said it requires improvement in the productivity of the agricultural sector, particularly small-scale farmers. I'd just like to ask you, what do you think the role of the government is? I know we all talked about reactive role of government, but what do you think the proactive role of government should be?
Thanks for that question. I think it depends on which part of the world we're talking about. If, say, we're talking about Australia. Okay, so if you're talking about Australia, I think the things we need to do right now is to reduce food waste, I think, and maybe the government can provide subsidies to supermarkets or incentives to try and reduce food waste. And they could, in fisheries, for instance, there's a lot of wastage of food. A lot of fish are just thrown out and not getting to the consumer. Maybe we could, in the first instance, provide incentives to reduce food waste. And secondly, I think in terms of climate change mitigation strategies, we need to think about reducing our reliance on maybe meat, reducing our green gas emissions, and reducing try and reduce our dependence on trying and expanding agricultural land and trying to cut down on expansions of the cities and try and maybe increase the productivity with the land that we actually have through greater agricultural technology. I guess incentives to research and technology in agriculture would be, yeah.
I could use this one. All I would add to that, and Anu's absolutely right, if you were thinking though of a country other than Australia, the level of development matters a lot here. And I think one of the main things in developing countries at least are what you might call some practical things like infrastructure. So infrastructure, both physical and otherwise, is really important here. One of the problems that we often see in developing country markets is that they don't function very well. And they don't function very well because of a range of issues. Part of it is infrastructure, because I can't get my produce to a wide market. And so that restricts their capabilities, if you like. It also means that they miss out in terms of prices. So what we often find is that markets don't work very well in developing countries because the information is not transmitted. And so you might find, there might be prices. If a price is high for a good in one market, let's say it might be 100 miles away, you need to know about that, because if you're a farmer, you want to send it to the place that's got the highest price, right? But you may not have any idea. You don't know because there's no information transmission going on. But then you've also got the physical infrastructure. You need roads and you need rail, And so that's related obviously to the role of the government.
Anything else?
Another question, because you're talking about how to integrate the agriculture price on the spot and to the agriculture commodity price on the speculation and hedge roles in the commodity market. So what do you think of the agriculture commodity financial market's role influence on the sport market, how to mitigate the price difference from like a rural area? Because you mentioned the information is not it's not equal for two sides. Maybe for some of the poor farmers with lack of information, and for those people have more information. So yeah, my question is how the agriculture commodity market, the financial market, would mitigate this kind of a role.
Well, it absolutely would, but again, it's not available to everybody, right? So there are a number of farmers around the world in developed countries that have actually good access to risk mitigation. You might want to call it, whether it's insurance, etc., right? And that helps them in terms of guarding against, poor events. In terms of access to finance, is that sort of what you're talking about in terms of farmers' access to finance, or are you talking about? Kind of. Yeah. Well, again, one of the problems that we see in developing countries is that they don't have access to finance. And it varies, and you see the rise of microcredit schemes in India, Bangladesh, and other countries now that are trying again, or this is one area where they are trying to make some inroads. But again, a lot of them are fairly poorly developed. The financial system needs infrastructure as well, right? And I don't mean physical infrastructure, but they need the rules of the game, they need regulations, and these sorts of things. So without that, farmers struggle, absolutely. And that, again, it just hampers their access. So it's all about access. It's not just access to the markets, but it's access to finance, etc. And these things are lacking in many areas of the world.
Also, I was just going to add that there's no crop insurance. So if they lose, the crops to droughts or pests and so on, they don't have any recourse. And also financial markets are a problem because of the same points that Andrew mentioned. We don't have, property rights are not well defined. And because they lack collateral, the lenders are reluctant to enter into those markets for poor farmers. Yeah.
During the 2007 to 2008, there was a really hiking price of agricultural commodity, mainly blamed because of number one, maybe biofuel output, and number two, the speculation role in the commodity market.
But there was also, are you talking just prior to the GFC? There was a big increase in a lot of agricultural commodity prices, but a lot of it was, so some of it, for example, corn was a major one, or maize, as they call it in America, and a lot of that was the demand increase, and that was what was increasing the price. And that was actually because of the demand for biofuels, not for eating. So people who are trying to eat maize, which is a large percentage of developing countries, certainly in Latin America, etc., were having to pay the higher price, but the price itself was spiking, was increasing, not exclusively, but in large part because of the demand for maize for other things as well. It wasn't all speculation. There was a real increase in demand across the board for most agricultural products around that time, and that was a function also of rising incomes in many regions of the world too. So I'm not suggesting that there was no speculative price spikes as you're sort of talking about, but there was also a general across the board. It was not all speculative. It was across the board big increase in the price of most agricultural commodities at the time. Yeah. Are we? How much time?
Yeah.
That's probably it.
Oh.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming on.